I'm going to talk, in some sense, what I'm going to talk about is the UK's experiment with sort of doing, in some sense, what Michael is recommending, which is radically expanding legal migration routes from a centrist position, actually done, of course, by the post-Brexit government of Boris Johnson, as I will explain, and what the impacts of that have been, which I think are very much consistent with what Michael said about what he would happen in a US context, but also towards the end about some of the political economies that poses for those of us who are of a liberal, both persuasion in economic terms on the migration issue, and some of the political dilemmas that arise and where we go next in the UK and perhaps elsewhere in Europe. So Brexit, of course, famously was a vote to restrict immigration, at least if you believe some of the more simplistic analyses. And in some sense it was. There's plenty of good political science evidence to suggest that many of people who voted for Brexit were indeed motivated by the desire to restrict immigration. And immigration was, as Adam said, indeed restricted in the sense that free movement of workers, free movement of people, a fundamental principle of the European Union and indeed of the single market, which the UK left as a result of Brexit, was abolished. And that did indeed lead to a very sharp fall in migration from Europe, net migration and gross migration from European countries to the UK. It fell almost immediately after the referendum, even long before we actually left the EU. And that decline accelerated during the pandemic and after Brexit. And at the same time, as analysts like me anticipated, there was a corresponding increase driven both by demand and policy of migration to the UK from outside the European Union. We anticipated that partly as a result of displaced demand, immigration from outside the EU would increase, and also policy was liberalized. So it was no surprise that that migration from outside the EU increased, and it was also boosted by flows of other migration flows, in particular refugees from Ukraine, the UK special visa policy for people from Hong Kong who had what's called British national overseas passports, and also irregular arrivals in the UK, people coming across the English Channel on small boats. But what neither I nor I think it's safe to say pretty much anybody else anticipated was this, which is the most dramatic rise in immigration in recorded and probably unrecorded UK history, unprecedented in terms of magnitude. So this is net migration. So this is even after taking account of outflows in the last couple of years. So in the last couple of years, we've had net migration. I think since Brexit in January 2021, we've had net migration of non-EU nationals to the UK of about 2 million. That's about 3% of the UK population, which obviously in US terms would be, what, 10 million, pushing 10 million or so now, I think. So that's quite a lot of people. And as I said, unprecedented in UK history. And you can see there, the blue line there is Europeans. But at the same time, Europeans migration fell from its peak in June 2016 at the time of the referendum, has fallen steadily since then, and is now, as best we can estimate, is now negative. There are more Europeans leaving the UK than coming in. Why did this happen? Well, basically it's because the UK government, then led by Boris Johnson, decided when it implemented Brexit and free movement ended, it decided that for political and economic reasons, it wanted to mitigate the negative impacts of Brexit, particularly in this initial shock on the UK economy. So it introduced a relatively liberal by the Standards of Advanced Economies system for what we call skilled migration. It essentially said that people who were employers hiring people to work in jobs that required a sort of fairly basic level of skill, more than what you might call high school education here, I think, roughly. Successfully graduating high school. And where salaries were higher than £25,000, which was roughly, that sounds like, that's $30-something thousand, not a lot by US standards. It's actually not far off. It was then a little bit below median wages in the UK. So not that high even for the UK. And it also streamlined a number of other requirements, in particular removing any quotas, lowering skill requirements, and eliminating the resident labor market test. You didn't have to show you couldn't hire a Brit for the job anymore. At the same time, it introduced a graduate visa, allowing people to stay on for 2 years after they finished studying in the UK. We have a lot of international students, and this further increased demand. And so the result of this was what you saw on the previous slide. Those of us who'd forecast that on net, the increase in non-EU migration would not even offset the fall in EU migration turned out to be, and that included me, it also included official government forecasts, turned out to be completely wrong. The increase in non-EU migration far more than offset the decrease in European migration. And so what does that do? This shows to the extent to which the UK labour market is increasingly the penetration of foreign-born workers in the UK labour market has increased steadily. I think it's now close to US levels, in fact, which for a country that is not historically immigration is quite surprising. And so this shows absolute levels. But if you look at the net employment change, so what's happened over the past 25 years, basically since I've been working in this policy area, here you can see that the number of UK-born workers in work is higher than it was in 2007, but it's basically flatlined overall over the last 20 years, and especially recently, pretty much all employment growth in the UK has been driven by migration. So we now have, and this is a net change, 5 million more people from outside the EU in the UK labour market than 25 years ago, whereas less than 2 million more people born in the UK on net in the year. So employment change over the last 25 years has been driven by non-EU workers, but especially in the last year or so. So this is employment of non-UK nationals, just focusing particularly over the last few years. And there again, you see that explosive growth in the number of non-EU origin workers, well over 1 million extra people just in the last 3 years. And this is quite interesting because what it shows is that actually of those 2 million non-EU origin workers, non-EU origin migrants who've come to the UK over the last 3 years, lots of them have come not on work visas. They've come on the graduate visa, which I spoke of, student visas, or as dependents, family, accompanying people who've come on work visas or accompanying people who've come as students. But nonetheless, that rise in migration has nevertheless translated to this very large growth in employment. In other words, people who are coming on other than work visas are actually participating in the labour market, or indeed are driving pretty much all employment growth in the UK. And you can see this again here by, this is employment rates. And this is quite important in the UK context, because if you look back again at 1997, you can see that the employment rate for people born outside the UK, that's the sort of brownish line here, was much lower than that for UK origin people at that time. In contrast, I think, to the US experience. Why is that? In large part, that reflects very low female labor force participation among some immigrant communities in the UK, in particular South Asians. So you often then had people who came to the UK for work or through asylum, but typically only the male member of the couple would work, and the female one often wouldn't. That is no longer the case. In the last few years, despite the fact that actually migration to the UK is still, to a very large extent, dominated by people of South Asian and more recently of Nigerian origin. Indians are by far the largest single group, but also lots of Nigerians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis. It is no longer the case that you have this sharp gap in labor force gender gap in labor force participation, and that has meant that the overall non-UK population has completely closed this very, very large labor force participation gap, suggesting that new migrants actually have a very high level of labor force participation, despite, as I said, that they're often not coming to work. So the result is that you've seen this very, very sharp recent growth. And this is partly, as I've said, Brexit. It's not just a Brexit effect. There's also a pandemic effect. And this shows, this is a chart from the last IMF WEO, which shows that the UK experience is actually quite, in some sense, comparable to the Canadian experience. You can also see the US experience here. So there is this US surge, but it's not, the US surge which Michael spoke of is not nearly as large as the Canadian surge, nor indeed as the UK surge, both of which are even larger. So you do have this surge. It is partly driven by global factors, the way that labor markets have evolved after the pandemic, which I think is an important thing to remember, but also by these specific policy decisions taken in the UK context. I'm just going to talk briefly about almost exactly the same topic that Michael talked about at the end of his slide, but again where the figures in the UK context are even more dramatic. So these are the simulations from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is sort of vaguely our equivalent of the Congressional Budget Office, but does the official long-term fiscal projections. And this shows the difference between a high and a low migration scenario in the UK, taking account of the necessary, that's the dotted lines, the necessary expenditures which would be incurred by government to maintain public services on a sort of per capita basis. In other words, what you have to do given you have higher level of population in terms of schools, hospitals, and the rest of it. And you can see, perhaps the best one to look at is the one on the right. This is the debt to GDP ratio, so some measure of fiscal sustainability. You can see that these are pretty big differences between not implausibly different, the difference between the high and low migration scenarios here is large, but it's no larger than the shock we've had, the shock relative to forecast we've had in the last few years. So this is not sort of some extreme case. These are plausible scenarios, and they show that the current scenario delivers sort of flatlining debt. That's not a coincidence because the government actually targets flatlining debt in the OBR central scenario. It's a policy variable. But if you have a low migration scenario, then you get that sort of not quite exploding, but certainly very concerning debt trajectory in the top line, whereas in the high migration scenario, you get a much more benign debt projection. But just to bring us up to date, the government has responded to what many, certainly I regard as a unexpected benefit and certainly mitigation of the negative economic impacts of Brexit. The government has responded to this by a sharp tightening of policy, and we've just had this really in the last 6 months, and it's beginning to feed through in the data now. So I won't go through the details here, but what you've essentially seen is a very, very sharp fall in visa issuance just in the last 6 months. Bringing it back to something like the more normal levels. So policy has responded. The government has been panicked by this sharp rise in migration and by what it perceives as the political threat from at least some sections of its constituency. Of course, as many of you know, we have an election in precisely 9 days' time, and we will see policy will be once again reset. We don't know how. But so this is, I think, a sort of, as it is here, a crucial choice moment for the UK as it is for the US, where the government will have to decide what it's going to do in response to this competing set of economic and political pressures. And this sort of summarizes the sort of economic impacts of the economic and fiscal impacts of migration, which are very consistent in the UK with what Michael was talking about in the UK, in the US. But politicians on both sides, and this is not something that's just about the Conservative Party, are subject to these political pressures. And I think I'll conclude by this, which I wrote in the FT yesterday, but again, it's very much consistent with what Michael said about the sort of politics or the political economy of migration, is that it seems to me that what we should be worried about, and certainly what a number of European countries have experienced, continental European countries have experienced in recent years, is what I would call the migration doom loop. That is to say that tighter migration makes the fiscal position worse. It makes it harder to finance public services. It also makes it harder to staff them. We know that if you impose austerity, whether in response to this fiscal tightening or anything else, it drives support for far-right parties. That is what we've seen in countries like France and Italy and Germany in recent years. Those far-right parties successfully blame the impacts of austerity, not on budget cuts, but on immigrants and elites. Meanwhile, you have a sort of separate sum doom loop, which is the one that Michael has described, which is if you tighten legal migration restrictions, you push up irregular migration for precisely the reasons that Michael said, and you have that in the US and as well as in Europe. The result, of course, is that it makes it even easier for far-right parties to say that the system is out of control. We need to get out of that doom loop. I wish I knew how, but hopefully we have some pointers from today's talk. Thank you very much.